I was sitting at a busy transit hub the other day, just watching people move. Have you ever really looked at the way humans walk? We're these tall, precarious towers, balancing on two thin, swaying pillars, losing energy with every awkward step. It's a physical struggle. Then a teenager zipped past me on a cheap electric unicycle. Fast, silent, and perfectly stable. In that moment, it was hard to ignore the irony. From a pure engineering standpoint, that $300 gadget was a more elegant solution for movement than the divine craftsmanship of the human body. If an omnipotent designer really sat down to draft the blueprint for humanity, why limit us to such an inefficient system? Why not a hybrid design, wheels for the flats and legs for the rough terrain? We like to think of ourselves as the pinnacle of creation, but looking at that kid on the scooter, we seemed more like a collection of good enough compromises. Usually when you point out these flaws, the theological answer is ready and waiting. Humans were designed to be imperfect so that we might grow through suffering. It's a poetic sentiment, but it carries a hidden, much darker edge. If our physical and moral imperfections aren't accidents but intentional features, then the tragedies they produce, the centuries of exploitation, the horrific screams of the witch hunts, weren't malfunctions. They were part of the plan. That's where the logic takes a chilling turn. If a creator knowingly builds a machine destined to break and cause agony to those around it, can we still measure that creator by our standards of good? Or does that being simply exist in a realm of pure power, where the distinction between a benevolent God and a calculated demon completely disappears? It forces us to look at the foundations of faith and ask a question that most are too afraid to voice. If he does exist, is he actually the one we should be worshiping? Okay, let's unpack this. That is a huge theological and philosophical challenge. And the sources we've gathered today, they give us this really unique platform to explore this whole idea of intentional design flaws, both divine and human. We're going to compare these Western theological justifications for suffering with the frameworks you see in East Asia. So the core mission of this deep dive is really synthesis. We're doing a comparative analysis of, well, the Christian problem of evil versus these East Asian secular and religious perspectives on human suffering. And we're asking, what happens to social ethics, to responsibility, when the concept of a single morally good creator is taken out of the equation?
Exactly. And we're taking that philosophical foundation, this idea of a design flaw, and we're going to apply it directly to modern societal structures. We'll be evaluating the structural tragedies of these hyper-competitive East Asian societies through that same theological lens. And we're trying to figure out if this systemic social suffering is just an inevitable byproduct of, rigid bureaucratic efficiency, a kind of man-made original sin.
And crucially, we have to see how the physical environment, the cities themselves, respond to this. We have some fascinating material on the impact of extreme urbanization and how technology sort of compensates for human alienation, sure, especially within these super high-density infrastructures. We'll be contrasting the approaches of the Tokyo and Seoul metropolitan areas. It's really a study in how we build systems, spiritual, social, and physical, that either alleviate or, frankly, just make the pain of the human condition even worse.
Right. So to organize this journey for you, we're going to synthesize the sources across three main areas. First, the philosophical debate over suffering itself, so Christian Theodicy versus Shinto Cosmology. Second, we'll look at the modern structural manifestation of this intentional suffering in South Korea, a place many of its own young people call Hell Joseon. And finally, how urban infrastructure and these technological fixes either compensate for or, as is often the case, tragically exacerbate this societal design flaw. So we have to begin with the foundation of the problem. This is the Western blueprint for justifying a flawed creation. It's the classic philosophical problem of evil, a challenge that it's occupied theologians and philosophers for millennia.
Right, and this is where we really hit that paradox you mentioned in the opening. How can you reconcile the existence of a God who has three key attributes, all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good, with the stark, observable reality of just so much evil and suffering in the world? Philosophers usually break this down into two things, right? The logical problem, which says those attributes of God are just logically incompatible with evil, and then the evidential problem, which is more about the sheer amount and intensity of suffering. A child dying painfully from a rare disease. It makes belief in an all-good God seem, well, highly improbable.
Exactly. And the primary traditional answer within Christian theology is what's called the Augustinian defense from St. Augustine. This framework, it fundamentally alters what you think of as evil. It suggests that evil is not a positive substance, not something God created, but rather it's a privation, bona lac, or a privation of good.
So like darkness is just the absence of light?
Precisely. It's a whole in existence, not an object.
And the implication there is critical, because if evil is just the absence of good, then God didn't create it. It came into the world through the misuse of a good gift: human free will.
And that leads you directly into the free will defense. This argues that moral evil things like cruelty, murder, theft, that is the price we pay for granting humanity genuine moral agency.
The argument being that a world with morally autonomous beings, even if they sometimes choose evil, it's metaphysically better than a world of robots who can only do good.
Right. So moral evil is justified because it allows for the greater good of free will and, genuine love. God permits the possibility of evil to ensure the reality of moral freedom.
But that still leaves a huge category of suffering, what theologians call natural evil: earthquakes, floods, disease. Suffering that has nothing to do with human choice. How do they justify that? That seems like an inherent structural flaw in the creation itself.
And here the defense has to shift. It often relies on what's called the afterlife theodicy. Thinkers like Thomas Aquinas, they contended that since the afterlife is eternal and, characterized by union with God, then all the finite suffering we experience here is justified and compensated for by the promise of everlasting, infinite joy. The pain now is insignificant when you weigh it against eternal bliss.
It's the ultimate deferred payment plan. Suffer now, get paid later. But you mentioned something before, that the existence of non-moral suffering, like animal suffering, is a massive weakness for this whole Western framework. Animals who don't have that moral agency for soul-making.
It is. It's a huge problem, because the other related defense is the Irenian, or soul-making theodicy. This one posits that suffering is necessary because it builds character, it builds virtue, resilience. Life is difficult because it's a test.
To forge our souls.
Yeah. Right. But that argument completely collapses when you're confronted with animal pain. There is just no credible theological framework that argues that the prolonged, agonizing suffering of a deer caught in a trap is somehow improving its moral character or preparing it for an afterlife reward.
Yeah.
It just suggests that some suffering is not a moral lesson. It's not a consequence of sin. It's simply an inescapable package deal, an unavoidable byproduct of a physical evolutionary system that just operates according to its own laws.
Let's really drill down on the most chilling critique of that Augustinian defense, the one we kind of rushed past.
Yeah.
If we fully accept the premise that whatever evil exists, God allows it for some greater good we can't comprehend, what does that mean for us morally, for the observers and the victims?
This is the profound philosophical objection. If every single instance of evil is ultimately reconciled to a greater, morally justified end, then humanity is faced with this immediate moral paradox. Doesn't this defense essentially nullify our moral duty to prevent evil?
Right. If I see a crime happening and I step in to stop it, am I not, in a way, preventing the greater good that God intended that suffering to produce?
Exactly. If suffering is part of the divine plan, then every doctor, every charity worker, every social justice advocate is, technically, fighting against a necessary step in the cosmic design.
It's a terrifying thought. It could provide a theological justification for just apathy, or even for endorsing evil because it serves some mysterious higher purpose.
The logical extension is that you should just accept all cruelty, which runs directly counter to the most fundamental ethical commands in the very same religions.
That's the breaking point.
It is. The intellectual gymnastics required to maintain all three qualities of God omnipotence, omniscience, and omnibenevolence leads to these profound moral contortions. And this difficulty is precisely why comparing it to a system that doesn't even accept those premises in the first place is so illuminating.
Okay, so if the Western blueprint for suffering is based on justifying a morally good creator who allows evil for a reason, where does a culture go when the whole concept of a soul or a single morally perfect deity is just irrelevant to the story of creation itself? This is where we have to pivot completely to the Shinto perspective.
In Shinto Cosmology, that entire challenge justifying evil to an all-good creator, it just doesn't exist. There's no concept of a singular omnibenevolent designer. Instead, you have a creation force. It's called musubi. It's this mysterious, productive spirit, the energy that brings things into being and connects them.
And critically, this force, musubi, it manifests in all living forms. Kami, which we translate as divinity or God's humanity, and nature are all metaphysically indistinguishable. So humanity isn't created by the Kami, but proceeds from the Kami.
Like a wave proceeds from the sea. That's a great analogy. It means there's no fundamental separation. There's no original sin that severs humans from their divine source.
Which then leads to a kind of dualism within the divine nature itself, right?
Yeah. Yes, a fundamental dualism. Divinity isn't defined by absolute purity. Both good, which is seen as pure, and evil, which is seen as impure or kegar. Both are inherent aspects of the kami nature. The Shinto creation myth with Zanagi and Izanami, it details the emergence of the kami and the islands of Japan, but it conspicuously fails to discuss the creation of man in that deliberate Western sense. It emphasizes this idea of co-emergence. We all just came from the same source.
The perfect illustration of this dualism is the Kami Susanoo. His full title, which kind of gives you a hint, is Brave, Swift, Male, Impetuous Augustinus. His nature is just, volatile, and destructive. He causes chaos and havoc in the heavenly realm, the divine world, and gets banished for it. But then when he descends to the earthly world, he becomes a hero. He restores order by slaying this terrible eight-forked serpent, the Yamata no Orochi.
That narrative is profoundly telling. Susanoo embodies both impurity, the havoc and purification, the heroism. Goodness is not a characteristic universally required of the kami. Some kami are benevolent, others are forces of chaos or misfortune. This view makes evil internal to the divine, a necessary component of the cosmic machine.
So it's an inescapable reality of existence.
It's just part of the package deal of creation. It's not some external flaw or a temporary problem that needs a complex explanation.
So without a morally good creator demanding explanations, that intense philosophical quest for the why of suffering theodicy, it just doesn't make cosmological sense. It's like asking why the tide goes out. It just does.
Exactly. Scholars like Moturi Norinaga really emphasize this point. There is no inherent reason or grand purpose for human suffering. The Shinto adherent must simply live to see what happens next. You accept the beauty and the tragedy as these interwoven elements of the natural order.
And this cosmological difference must drastically shape social ethics.
Oh, completely. Since there's no concept of internal, divinely judged guilt or original sin, the primary social standard and motivator becomes external. It's Haji shame, disgrace, or dishonor. Evil is defined not by the state of your soul, but by the effect your actions have on the community and on your public standing.
And that external focus fundamentally changes the whole concept of justice. The community, not some distant deity, is the ultimate judge. That makes shame far more immediate and terrifying.
Haji is an incredibly powerful social motivator because the whole focus is on avoiding pollution kagar and maintaining purity, both for yourself and for the collective.
That fear of being ostracized, it drives conformity, and historically it led to some really extreme measures to purge the community of impurity.
Yes, if a family or an individual faced unpardonable public shame, a deep societal Haji, the sources discuss how suicide could tragically be seen as the only honorable escape. This links directly to the strong social demands of Bushido, the way of the samurai, where honor was absolutely paramount.
So to put it simply, if the Western system demands an internal moral inventory to ensure salvation, the Shinto influence system demands meticulous external performance to maintain your social standing and the purity of the group.
And this sets the stage for a society where public failure or public exposure of failure is exponentially more catastrophic than any private internal guilt.
So this brings the entire discussion back to the secular puzzle we raised at the start. We've seen that both theological systems, in their own ways, struggle with the sheer amount of suffering in the world. But the puzzle remains, even without a deity. Why do humans inflict harm on one another, sometimes through pure, unmotivated malice, where the perpetrator gains literally nothing?
If psychological egoism, the idea that everything we do is driven by self-interest, were completely true, these irrational cruelties, these moments of pure sadism, they'd be unexplainable.
It just forces us back to that original thought, that maybe human nature itself is just a good enough compromise. An imperfect machine built with inherent, inescapable flaws that just inevitably produces cruelty and suffering as a byproduct.
And that is the crucial bridge. If we accept the idea of an intrinsic design flaw, whether you call it divine or evolutionary, that flaw gets amplified when it's embedded into human-designed systems, rigid bureaucratic systems. That amplification, that is the definition of structural tragedy.
And now we transition from those abstract design flaws of the cosmos to the very concrete, institutional design flaws of modern South Korea. The sources frame this intense, high-pressure existence, often termed Hell-Joseon, as a structural tragedy born from a phenomenon they call double-compressed modernity.
This term, Hell-Joseon, it's highly critical, but it's widely used by young people. It reflects a deep, deep cynicism toward their society. And the term is powerful because it deliberately invokes the old feudal monarchy of the Joseon dynasty. It implies that the current, seemingly modern society is just as rigid, just as hierarchical, and just as inescapable as the old caste system was.
And the mechanism for this tragedy is this double compressed modernity. So South Korea experienced this incredibly rapid nationalist-driven industrialization after the war. That's the first modernity. Then, almost immediately after achieving that economic miracle, it was thrust into a similarly rapid shift toward globalization and neoliberalism. That's the second modernity. And this whole process was driven by a powerful state working hand in glove with massive corporate structures.
Think of it as societal development running at triple speed, but without any time for the social, psychological, or welfare infrastructure to catch up. This hyperspeed compressed development has profoundly distorted the social landscape, especially for the youth who are now paying the physical and psychological price for their parents' and grandparents' economic success.
The outcome is brutal. It's a systemic distortion that leaves young Koreans feeling completely trapped. The sources state it very starkly. They feel they have only two choices: study and labor until they burn out as willing slaves, or they can unwillingly flee the world of overwork and excessive self-exploitation. There's no middle ground.
And this pressure is maintained by an economic system where immense power is concentrated in very few hands. The massive conglomerates known as the K-ball firms, Samsung, Hyundai, LG, they hold this prevailing dominance over the entire economy. They aren't just companies. They're quasi-state entities that function as job creators, financial engines, and effectively oligarchs.
And the result of that dominance is just staggering economic disparity. The sources describe this concentration of wealth as part of the country's oligarchic rule. The top 1% owns over 25% of the wealth, while the bottom 50% holds a shockingly minimal 2%. This inequality is the foundational flaw that makes all the subsequent competition so desperate.
The most visible engine of this tragedy is the hyper-competitive education and class system. Education in this environment, it's not about intellectual exploration. It's about securing a position in a high-stakes, zero-sum game. The pressure to get into one of the top SKY universities at Seoul National, Korea, and Yonsei is suffocating because failing to do so is perceived as a near-permanent failure in life.
There's an analogy they often use to describe this system, and it's incredibly apt. Imagine you're in a theater and someone stands up to get a better view. Now they have an advantage. So the person behind them stands up, and then the person behind them. Eventually, everyone is standing up. No one has gained an advantage. The view is the same for everyone, but now everyone is significantly more uncomfortable.
That is the core insight. The competition is self-defeating. The individual rational choice to study harder, to get more certificates, leads to a universally irrational collective outcome, which is just profound systemic stress. Education, in this context, isn't necessarily securing success, it's simply preventing immediate catastrophic failure.
And this desperation gives rise to the concept of the one-shot society. The term reflects a severe lack of societal resilience. It's totally unforgiving. If you fail once, if you miss that top university slot, if your business fails, if you take a break for a year, you're often just considered a loser. The system offers very little tolerance for second chances or, alternate career paths.
And the deepest sign of despair emerging from this generation is the widespread acceptance and use of the spoon class theory. The distinction between Guillaume Sujeo, a gold spoon, and Hoeksita, a dirt spoon. This terminology is a sociological admission that the youth have completely abandoned the belief in meritocracy.
It's an explicit acknowledgement that the economic game is rigged. Family background now plays a crucial, often decisive role in your advancement. The high-speed market economy, which was once heralded as this engine of an open society, has matured into a system dominated by rent-seeking and class reproduction. It confirms a feudal inequality where your inequality is inherited.
The gold spoon kids get the opportunities regardless of their effort, and the dirt spoon kids struggle regardless of theirs.
And this problem is compounded by the prolonged and agonizing job-seeking period. Even after you graduate from a highly competitive university, employment is far from guaranteed.
Graduates have to spend, on average, a year or even a year and a half in what is essentially a postgraduate survival phase.
They're studying for multiple standardized tests. The TOEIC English Language Ability Test is mandatory. They're getting certificates in Microsoft Office, maybe Mandarin or specific technical skills. And they're doing all this while meticulously crafting resumes for a tiny, tiny chance at a position. This marathon of preparation is purely because of the overwhelming volume of applicants, which necessitates more and more filtering systems just to cull the herd.
And we have to connect this back to the family structure. The compressed modernity created a minimalist welfare state. This forced citizens into what are called social investment families. Parents rely heavily on their children's success, and children rely heavily on the parents' resources for education and, crucially, for housing capital. So much of the cost of Social Security and advancement has to be shouldered by the individual family, which just deepens the pressure on both generations.
Moving beyond careers, these structural design flaws warp the most fundamental human interactions, particularly relationships and marriage. The tradition of instrumental familism persists, which means marriage has historically been seen as an alliance between families, where the spouse is considered an asset to the extended family structure.
And while that tradition has modernized, the financial burden remains a catastrophic barrier. Marriage preparation is prohibitively expensive. It often leads to breakups over money. The customs demand these very specific financial contributions. The man is expected to prepare the marital home, and the sources specify at least 2 rooms are required. A 1-room apartment is socially unacceptable.
He also provides the car, while the woman traditionally prepares all the furniture and appliances. The cost of entry into marital life is just astronomical.
And even when both individuals in a couple recognize how outdated and economically destructive this culture is, they still struggle immensely to bypass these expectations. The driving psychological mechanism here is this fear of judgment, or unchi. It literally translates to measure from the eye. It is the powerful, almost suffocating desire to conform to perceived social standards. It's the fear of other people's thoughts and eyes, and the shame that's associated with being exposed at a low level.
This profound reluctance to expose yourself or your partner as financially or socially inadequate prevents couples from just marrying cheaply or efficiently. They feel compelled to meet these insane expectations to maintain honor and avoid public disgrace, which ties directly back to those external ethics we were talking about earlier with Haji.
Right. And this intense rigidity, it inevitably fuels generational conflict. The older generation, the ones who built the economic miracle by working these punishing hours, fathers coming home at 10 or 11 p.m., they did so under the developmentalist, nationalist values of success and survival. They endured the suffering for a perceived collective reward.
But the new generation, having inherited all the stress but none of the corresponding opportunities, is actively rejecting those values. They're seeking free time and stability over high success. They often prefer less prestigious but more stable jobs like public officer positions because they recognize the extreme hierarchy and burnout culture of the cable companies as an inefficient and just fundamentally flawed way to live.
Furthermore, the youth are keenly aware of the demographic trends. Life expectancy in Korea is now extremely high, around 90 for women, late 80s for men. They see that the older generation, which often had many children, split their inherited wealth multiple ways. But the current generation, with often only one child, concentrates that inherited wealth, which just reinforces the cycle. The rich stay rich and the poor stay poor. It solidifies their sense that the structural design of society is intentionally stacked against any kind of upward mobility. And these structural design flaws, they're not merely abstract. They produce physical and social symptoms that are pervasive and measurable, particularly in the urban environment.
The primary symptom is this devastating concentration of opportunity in Seoul. It acts like an economic black hole. All the top universities, all the headquarter jobs, the essential networking opportunities, they're all clustered in the capital region. This draws ambitious people from secondary cities and rural areas, despite the staggering cost of living.
This Seoul-centric focus is a massive social cost. It leaves secondary cities struggling and rural areas economically and socially hollowed out, basically dead. The overwhelming belief is that to have the best job prospects, you must be in Seoul. And that often requires attending one of the top Seoul universities, regardless of the personal cost.
And the financial barrier to just existing in Seoul is immediate and drastic, primarily because of their unique housing system. The system often requires a massive lump sum deposit known as chonts.
This deposit can be 10 to 20 times the monthly rent. It's an enormous financial hurdle.
So to clarify, chonts is, it's a massive interest-free 2-year deposit you give the landlord.
Exactly. The landlord invests that deposit, uses the interest as their profit, and then returns the full deposit when the tenant leaves. This system instantly creates and reinforces wealth disparity. Your quality of life is determined not by your monthly income, but by your ability to access that enormous upfront deposit capital. It functions as a brutal wealth filter right at the societal entrance.
The physical manifestation of the desperation created by all this competitive pressure is the existence of the goshi-tel. These are micro-rooms, often windowless, with shared facilities. They're symbols of the intense competition and the physical confines placed on those trying to advance. I think one anecdote in the sources described a single building floor housing 40 people, all sharing one kitchen and a couple of bathrooms. It's the absolute minimum living standard necessary for survival while competing.
And this environment also fosters a very unique culture of hidden suffering that's deeply tied to that fear of judgment, umchi. Unemployed young adults still trying to study and job seek, they often avoid using public resources like university libraries.
Why? Why would they do that?
Why? Because of the psychological burden of being seen by younger students or their peers, which would signify their failure or their precarious status.
They don't want to expose their vulnerability.
Exactly. So instead, they spend money they often don't have to sit alone in expensive coffee shops. These cafes effectively become library cafes, places where job seekers hide out, spending hours studying in this contained, reluctant culture that avoids the public exposure of failure. It's a profound social consequence of a high-context society where hiding your suffering is prioritized over seeking open support.
It's important to note, though, that this physical reality isn't universal across East Asia's high-density urban areas. Nearby Tokyo offers a really compelling counterpoint in urban design that consciously tries to mitigate some of this psychological pressure.
Right. Tokyo's urban planning model prioritizes mental health by creating spaces that are green, active, social, and safe, and the key mechanism is their management of vehicle traffic. By efficiently concentrating cars onto main arterial roads, the vast network of side streets, which make up most of the city, is allowed to become tranquil, walkable, and green.
And these smaller streets are often maintained by local residents, facilitated by government programs that offer workshops and tax incentives for creating small green spaces. It's a decentralized, organic urban model that allows these pockets of quiet coexistence to emerge. It creates what sociologists call third places, spaces for incidental, non-commercial social interaction and quiet reflection, which actively combats that psychological alienation of high-density living.
Meanwhile, back in South Korea, the mechanisms of control and efficiency were really amplified during the COVID-19 pandemic, which illustrated the state's willingness to use advanced technology to manage the population. The authorities coordinated their response by expanding what were already described as formidable surveillance technologies for tracing, tracking, and mining the activities of ordinary citizens.
So this health crisis provided an enormous, almost irresistible boost to the big data industries and financial capital. The governing elite successfully mobilized strong Confucian ideals, the public's willingness to trust experts and conform for the collective good, to secure acceptance of a massive digital encroachment into private life.
They used the crisis not just to manage the virus, but to reinforce corporate and state dominance, effectively reproducing and solidifying the very social conditions widely recognized as hellish.
And this unrelenting pressure cooker environment inevitably generates severe social friction. It manifests in highly volatile conflicts, most notably the intense and often toxic gender war. This is a really complex conflict, and it's fueled by real structural pressures.
The sources highlight the radicalization on both sides. On the far right, you have groups like Ilbo, which gain notoriety for misogynistic behavior posting revenge porn, upskirt pictures, where participants express views that essentially denied women equal human status. This fosters an atmosphere where many women live with the fear that any man they meet might harbor these deeply hateful views.
And conversely, you had radical feminist movements like Megalia emerge. They used highly confrontational language, often intentionally mirroring men's derogatory terms right back at them. The intent was to critique misogyny by reflecting its own ugliness. But this mirroring action often led to a massive and defensive backlash, creating a toxic cycle that prevents any constructive dialogue about the genuine structural inequalities from even taking place.
A central structural grievance that fuels this conflict on the male side is the mandatory military draft. Young men are required to serve their nation for an extended period, which they contrast with the perceived advantages women may have in the workplace or education because they're exempt from this service.
And this perceived disadvantage leads many young men to feel that they're victims of reverse discrimination, which contributes significantly to this volatile, misogynistic backlash.
The language used in this conflict reflects this cycle of despair and accusation. Terms like yohayum, which means hatred towards women, or common, alongside the politically charged term kimchinyan.
Right. And to be clear and neutral about this term, as the sources are, kimchinyan is highly critical and often used politically to describe women who are perceived as relying economically on men while simultaneously emphasizing equal rights only when it's convenient. The term developed from an earlier criticism of women as wasteful for buying things like expensive coffee, and it has since been weaponized in political and social discourse against perceived female consumerism and economic dependency. We're reporting on the term, not endorsing the viewpoint.
Exactly. And the ultimate, most tragic symptom of this entire structural flaw is the mass act of just giving up. The sources detail two phenomena that reflect a severe nihilistic apathy and a sense of complete hopelessness.
First, there's Dogwan. It means beyond giving up. It's the act of accepting the reality of a minimum wage existence. This isn't just apathy, it's a structural resignation. You abandon the entire rat race because the cost of competing is too high and the rewards are impossible to attain.
Second, there's Teljazan. It literally means escaping Korea. This refers to emigration, reflecting the belief that the system is unfixable and the only solution is to physically leave the country.
These critical terms and actions, they function less as tools for hopeful mobilization towards political change or a better Yosean, and more as just undeniable signs of despair and resignation.
The young generation is trying to create havens for themselves, prioritizing lifestyle, travel, aesthetics. But this often remains a privilege limited to those who have some means of escape or, the capital to resign gracefully.
So we have traced this entire thread from the initial theological concept of suffering, whether it's an intentional moral or non-moral design flaw, all the way to the structural realities of modern East Asia.
And the deep dive reveals that these structural tragedies in hyper-competitive societies, they function as modern man-made design flaws. They create systems where systemic suffering is not a bug, but an inevitable byproduct of a rigid nationalist efficiency enforced by inherited inequality and immense social pressure.
The philosophical justifications for suffering, the promise of an afterlife, or the simple acceptance of a dualistic, non-moral universe, they're replaced here by purely human mechanisms. Relentless hyper-competition, the oligarchical concentration of capital, and the pervasive suffocating pressure of umshi, that fear of external judgment.
The structural design of South Korea is ruthlessly efficient at generating national wealth and global competence, but it is catastrophically inefficient at generating social well-being or even basic financial security for the majority of its young population. It's a machine that achieves its primary economic goal by intentionally sacrificing the resilience and happiness of its users.
Which brings us right back to the irony of the electric unicycle and the human body. A flawed design built by a creator, whether divine or human, who settled for a good enough compromise that maximizes one metric: speed, wealth, efficiency at the expense of all the others. Comfort, equity, joy.
And that leads us to a final provocative thought. In a society defined by the one-shot mentality and this intense, isolated rivalry, competitive acts can sometimes lead to unexpected solidarity.
We saw that paradox revealed in the anecdote of rivals, these young job seekers gathering to rehearse interviews and form study groups. These are individuals competing directly for the same scarce, life-defining positions, and yet they choose to coalesce. They're pooling their resources, their intelligence, not in a spirit of hopeful collaboration, but in a shared realization that the competitive system itself is the true enemy.
This paradoxical unity, this moment of coexistence born out of mutual desperation, suggests that while the societal system may be expertly designed for ruthless competition and individual isolation, the shared realization of its inescapable flaw forces connections that transcend individual self-interest, forging bonds that are perhaps stronger and more necessary than those found in societies with wider, safer safety nets.